Catholic Couples volunteer crew, led by Cynthia and Jeff Sheeks, and an entire cast of folks that made all this come together. Their names are currently in this brochure, and it's part of a bigger part in the program. If you are interested in learning more about Westside Catholic Couples and the ministry, at the conclusion of Dr. Kreeft's second talk, there'll be a brief talk by one of our couples to explain really what the ministry is all about and to learn more about it. If you want to learn more about the ministry or perhaps join the ministry, tear off the sheet in the program and drop it in the basket up here at front. Starting at 11 o'clock, we're privileged to offer the Sacrament of Reconciliation here at St. Sebastian's. It'll begin promptly at 11:05. And the way it is set up, we have 5 confessors here in the building, so you could discreetly leave your pew and find your way to one of the confessionals. We're pleased to welcome Father Dismas from Visitation of Mary. Father Dismas will be in the Padre Pio Chapel, which is the old baptistry in the rear of the church facing Mull Avenue. Father Haleko will be in our guest confessional, which I believe is right up here. Father Haleko is up in vertical, and good to see you. Thanks for coming today. Awesome, great. Father Bernard, also from Visitation of Mary, will be in the server sanctuary, which is back in this area. I need to mention that Father Bernard and Father Dismas will have the opportunity to administer the sacrament in a face-to-face fashion only. The other confessors have screen available. Father Valenchek will occupy his confessional, which is at your right in the rear of the church. Father Bosek similarly will be in his confessional at the rear of the church. I mentioned the resources of the Catholic radio stations in the back. We also have books available, Dr. Kreeft's books available for purchase, as well as a terrific book by Jacques Philippe called Interior Freedom. Dr. Kreeft apologizes he's not available to do book signings today. We have to whisk him away promptly at noon. But if you want to learn more about the great work that Dr. Kreeft does, and the 2 books in particular, Jesus Shock and Prayer for Beginners, are available. Okay, enough about the housekeeping. I mentioned this is a program in 2 acts, so what we're going to do is we're going to reconvene now. Dr. Kreeft will give his second talk, and we'll conclude about 11:30 a.m., not 11:30 p.m., that's a long day. 11:30 a.m., and we'll have some time for Q&A. So if you want to jot down a question and drop it in the basket, we already have some terrific questions entered. We'll do what we can to get through as many of those as we can. Again, on behalf of Westside Catholic Couples and our parish here at St. Sebastian's, we very much appreciate you being here and being a part of this terrific event. And at this time, I'm welcoming Dr. Kreeft back up to the ambo.
I want to make sure everyone can hear me. In the back? No problem? All right. Well, I presented the problem. What do we do about it? What's the solution? Well, to make it very simple, it's not our solution, it's God's solution. What can we do to be a part of His solution? Well, God's not an optimist and He's not a pessimist. And we can't afford to be either of those two either. We can't be an optimist and say, well, God is God and He's going to win, so we can just sit back and watch. On the other hand, we can't be pessimists. We can't be saying the odds are stacked against us and our enemies are formidable and we don't know what to do. We're going to lose. Oh dear, let's wring our hands. Obviously, we can't do either of those two things. We can't idolize politics and culture, and we can't hide from it either. So that's what's not to do, 2 extremes. Almost always, mistakes are opposites. Old commonsensical Aristotle says that every moral virtue has 2 opposite vices. Chesterton put it this way: there's always more than one angle at which you can fall, but only one angle at which you can stand straight up. Well, is my prognosis then optimistic or pessimistic? It's neither, because it depends on how we fight. The future is not set in stone. God sees it, but that doesn't mean it's fated. It arrives by our free choice. We can change the future. We can't change God's plans, but we can change ours. God uses two means to get his ends. One means is the things in nature, the forces that don't pass through human free choice. And the other, the most powerful means God uses to get what he wants, is us, our free choices. How well the soldiers fight. In Vietnam, we had all the advantages except one: faith. They had faith. That was their God. They're going to win. They never give up. And they won. We had the bombers and the bombs and the people and the technology, and we lost. We lost to Ho Chi Minh. We beat Adolf Hitler, who had the greatest war machine in human history, and we lost to a tin pot dictator. Why? Because we believed in one cause and not in the other. The prognosis that I see is both very bad and very good. Why is it very bad? Because I think it's pretty clear from divine revelation and from our own history, the facts of history, that the other side, the enemy, is never, ever going to be satisfied. All he wants is freedom of choice, no. All he wants is separation of church and state, no. All he wants is secularization, no. All he wants is to desacramentalize marriage, no. All he wants is approval of sodomy, no. All he wants is abortion, no. All he wants is transgenderism, no. Never satisfied. What's the next step? Everything and anything. If marriage is a creation of man and not of God, then it can be whatever you want to be. Then the most popular lie that is told to our children, especially in commencement addresses, namely that you can be whatever you want to be, which is simply a lie, becomes true. So, you don't have to be male or female, and you don't have to be two. Why limit marriage to two? Why not three? Why not four? There's no answer to that question. Why not? Some time ago, a cannibal advertised for willing victims in Germany. He got 28 affirmative responses. The government said, we can't do anything about it. There's no law against it. They tried to discourage him somehow. I don't know what came of it. But why not cannibalism? In Canada, they already have suicide parties. They celebrate a suicide the day before it happens. Nothing is enough for the devil. He's a black hole. A black hole wants to eat the whole universe into itself. So he never, ever, ever gives up. And the only force that can beat that is a force that also never, ever, ever gives up. If the light gives up, the darkness wins. If neither the light nor the darkness gives up, the light wins. A little match in an enormous dark building isn't put out by the darkness, it puts the darkness out. The devil's a creature, he's finite. God's the creator, he's infinite. The devil can't possibly win. He knows that. Why is he fighting? Because he is hate incarnate. He has a death wish. So it's not going to end before the end. So we're always going to be on the battlefield. And what happens to evil also happens to good in time. It changes. For every up, there's a down. For every down, there's an up. If today was a good day for you, if good things happened to you, if you got some problem solved today, and you thanked God for it, you can be guaranteed that tomorrow God's going to test you in the opposite way. He's going to withdraw some of his gifts, and he's going to give you some burdens to bear, some part of the cross. And if today you're carrying a terrific burden, know that you're not necessarily carrying that burden tomorrow. It's going to be lifted in some way. Life is a roller coaster. Only God doesn't change. Everything else changes. Life itself is a roller coaster. It rises for about 33 years, and then it starts to decline. And it declines more and more, and it accelerates, and then finally it dies. And that's not the end. Then there's resurrection. I think Fulton Sheen wrote a sermon or an article about the rosary when there were just three parts of the rosary, not four. One for sorrow, two for joy. There's an up, and there's a down, and there's an up. Life is a joy, then life is a sorrow, and then there's infinite joy. And even right now, what's happening in the world is not the same as what's happening in Western civilization. We're on a big decline. That's not happening in the rest of the world. Christianity is growing everywhere else in the world, except here. And the church always responds with a vaccine for every disease. And if the sexual revolution is the disease that is corrupting our civilization, is the church responding? Yes. For every heresy, there's a creed that defines it and refutes it and increases our wisdom. And George Weigel, who I think is one of the most intelligent and faithful Catholics in the world, says that the church's most potent creedal answer, well, it's not quite a creed yet. The church's most potent philosophical answer since Thomas Aquinas 700 years ago is the one given by John Paul II, clearly the greatest man of the 20th century. If you've never checked out his theology of the body, please do so. It is the church's definitive answer to the sexual revolution. Almost everybody that I know who has looked at it has been deeply impressed by it. It's the positive version of the negative. And God is raising up saints in our age because saints are like doctors. They appear when diseases appear. And they're all little saints. Saint Teresa of Lisieux, the little flower, her little way. Do little things with a lot of love. That's more important than ruling the world. Teresa of Calcutta, a little woman with infinite love. Saint Faustina, the saint behind Divine Mercy. We're celebrating tomorrow, Divine Mercy Sunday. My favorite prayer is, I like things simple and short. It's 5 words. Jesus, I trust in you. No matter how bad things get, you can be infallibly assured of his promise. I am with you always. When you feel abandoned, say, Jesus, are you still with me? And he will answer yes in one way or another. Guaranteed. What are our weapons in this war? Granted that it exists, we have enemies, we've got to fight, we can't ever, 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 ever give up. Our first weapon is God's activity, what God has done. God has come. He has become a soldier fighting side by side with us so that we can fight with him. He has guaranteed success. He has revealed himself. What's Jesus' answer to the problem of human suffering? Jesus is the face of God. Jesus is the revelation of God. Jesus is the full revelation of God. There's nothing more in the Father that's not in the Son, all right? So you look at Jesus and you see the nature of ultimate reality, all right? What does ultimate reality think about our suffering? Jesus shows you as well as tells you. When Lazarus, one of his best friends, died, and he went to Lazarus' grave, you have the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. That's God's answer to our suffering. He is with us in it. He doesn't immediately take it away from us, but he radically transforms it. Our suffering now becomes his suffering. Would you rather be with him on the cross or without him off the cross? But Jesus didn't feel the presence of God, and we often don't feel the presence of God. Very rarely. If you're a recent convert or revert, you probably had a honeymoon, and God gave you a wonderful sense of his presence. That's not going to last for the rest of your life, guaranteed. The honeymoon isn't forever. Feelings are like waves. They come and go. And the top of the wave, I love surfing, including body surfing. The top of the wave is where all the fun is, the froth and the bubbles. And that's what you aim for, especially if you're on a board. The trough of the wave is the dangerous part, the dark part. But that's where all the power is. Fulton Sheen, who will certainly be canonized as a great saint and probably a doctor of the church, often said, don't waste your suffering. It's powerful. If it's participating in Christ's suffering, if you're one with Christ, and therefore your suffering is participating in his, it's not just yours, it's his. That's the most powerful thing in the world. Suffering and love together are the most powerful force in the world. That's the one thing the devil can't do. He can't love and he can't suffer. Love without suffering is nice, but it's not terribly powerful. That's sort of typically American. We're nice, we're comfortable, we're good people, we're loving. Suffering without love, that's tough, that's powerful, but that's not going to redeem the world. That's terrorism. Fulton Sheen said back when communism was the enemy, communism is suffering without love. American Christianity is love without suffering. Neither will conquer the world. We know God because God revealed himself to us. Whether we feel God or not doesn't matter. When I was reading my way into the Catholic Church, and I read many of the saints and many of the fathers of the church, I was very surprised at two things they said about becoming a saint, which is, of course, the meaning of life. Methods are not that important. Methods of prayer, though helpful, are not nearly as important as we think. And the second thing is that feelings are not nearly as important as we think. Watchman Nee, a Protestant Chinese mystic, has this parable about the relation between faith and feeling. He says, imagine three men walking on a wall, a high wall. Faith is in the middle, fact or truth is in the front of him, and feeling is in the back of him. And as long as faith keeps his eyes ahead on fact, all three men walk along the wall successfully. But when faith takes his eyes off of fact and turns around and worries about how feeling is doing, he falls off the wall, and so does feeling. But fact never does. God is a fact. He's not a feeling. Do you feel his presence? Wonderful. That's a gift. Do you not? Wonderful. That's also a gift. Love is not a feeling. Most Americans are shocked by that. If love is a feeling, then we fall out of love as well as we fall into love. Faith is not a feeling. Faith is an act of the will, just as love is an act of the will. Trust is an act of the will. When you put your money in the bank, that's an act. That's an act of trust. You trust the bank. It's the First National Bank and Trust Company. You bank on it. You entrust your riches to the bank. Well, God is the first supernatural bank and trust company. Trust is an act, a choice. It's active. Hope is a choice of the will. Hope means believing God's plan for you for the future. Hope means believing the hardest verse in the Bible to believe, but the most wonderful. All things work together for good to those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. It certainly doesn't look like it. Look at the world, look at your life. Does it look like all things are working together for good? Of course not. It looks like things are falling apart. God himself says, I work those evils into good. I did it at the crucifixion, the worst evil in the history of the world, the deliberate torture and murder of God Almighty. And we celebrate that as Good Friday. That's our salvation. If he can do it there, he can do it everywhere. Even joy is not fundamentally a feeling. Christ is our joy. However you feel about the bank, that's where your money really is. And that's Christ. And the bank is everything in you, your heart. The Mary and Martha story I love because it is a kind of a symbol of the two parts of life. Mary is simple, pure faith, and Martha is works. And one of the saints, I forget who, said, we must do the works of Martha in the spirit of Mary. Mary trusts Christ, and Jesus says that's the first thing. That's the one thing necessary. Poor Martha, you should be there at my feet with Mary. You're doing good work, fine. But first trust me, then obey me. Trust and obey. Two most important words in the world. It's all there. In the Lord's Prayer, Christ has us pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. What's the difference between the two? Well, thy kingdom come. What is God's kingdom? Jesus says the kingdom of God is within you. The kingdom of God is in your heart. The kingdom of God is his presence in your part of the mystical body. And then he says, thy will be done. Where? On earth. That's the works of love. Love starts in the heart, and it goes into the world. Same thing. Same thing comes in one end and out the other, like in a ramjet. The air that flows into the front of the jet is superheated and then shoots out the back. And that's what a human soul is designed to do. First faith, then works. Faith works. The faith works controversy that sparked the Protestant Reformation was a big mistake. It's not an either or, it's a both and. And they're not just two different things. It's not a two-part ticket, it's a one-part ticket. The same life of God that comes in by faith goes out by works. What comes in by trust goes out by obedience. And since that force is love itself, agape, divine love, the thing God is made of, so to speak, since God is 100% love, he can't stop loving any more than the sun can stop shining. That's the force that is guaranteed to win, has to win. It's absolute. It's the nature of God. The devil doesn't stand a chance. He's already been whooped, definitively, 2,000 years ago. Justice is not always going to win in this world. And justice isn't the very nature of God. It's the shape of rightness. But the Bible doesn't say God is justice. It says God is love. Justice means giving what is deserved. Love means giving what is more than deserved, what is not deserved. It wasn't justice that created the world. It wasn't justice that gave us divine life. It was pure love. We didn't deserve it. We didn't even exist to deserve anything, much less deserve to be created. Justice is important, and it's a moral absolute, and it's an obligation, but it's not the very nature of God. And that certainly includes social justice. It's a part of the gospel, but it's not the essence of it. The gospel doesn't exist for the sake of social justice or for the sake of winning the culture or for the sake of making people happy. It exists for the sake of God himself. There's a description of this agape, this divine love, in the Russian language as a word that can't be translated into English. And you find it in Dostoevsky, especially in the Brothers Karamazov. It's the word sobornost. It's a kind of, well, it's an interpretation of what the mystical body means. As in a body, every single organ and every single cell is interdependent with every other organ and every other cell, such that if any part of the body suffers, the whole body suffers. And what you eat and what you breathe doesn't stay in the stomach, it doesn't stay in the lungs, it reverberates through the whole body and contributes to the health of the whole body. Well, Christ is that whole body, and we are his cells. And therefore, you will find in many of the Orthodox mystics sayings like this: when you go home today and you are unkind and cruel for a minute to your friend, and you sin against charity, the result may be that because of that, somebody that you never met, who isn't even born yet and lives on the other side of the world, won't have enough grace to overcome his temptation. And if you go home this afternoon and do one extra deed of charity to your neighbor, the result may be that 100 years from now, that person on the other side of the world will have enough grace to resist his temptation and become a saint. Everything is related to everything. That's true in the physical universe. All the fundamental forces of matter are universal. Gravity, for instance, everywhere. Everything in the universe loves everything else in the universe. Gravity is the physical form of love, because the end of love is unity. You want to be with the beloved. Well, all matter is in love with other matter. That's why things fall. Now, in the physical universe, it's quantitative, and science can measure it. And gravity is precisely measurable. The more the mass and the less the distance, the more the gravity. Why shouldn't the spiritual universe be just as unified as the physical universe? More unified and more complexly. There are no victimless crimes. Every sin you sin against all humanity. And you are therefore, in some indirect but real way, responsible for all the evil in the world and all the good in the world. St. Francis of Assisi preached to the birds. And one of the heroes in the Brothers Karamazov, Father Zosima, said, I pray to the birds, please forgive me, birds, because if I were a little holier, you'd be a little happier, because in some way you're part of that too. When we adore Christ, especially in Eucharistic adoration, we adore the Christ who is, in some sense, that universal force, not just an abstract force, but a concrete, incarnate force working through us for all the good of the world, for the salvation of the world, for that first thing, eternal salvation, and therefore for the second things, which is the salvation of natural things, including culture. So really, though indirectly, the most powerful thing you might be able to do to save our culture is Eucharistic adoration, because you're not just adoring a Christ who's limited to that host in the tabernacle. You're adoring the Christ who is at work in all the good in the whole world. And you're saying, make me an instrument of your peace. And if you mean that with all your heart, he will certainly do it in ways that you probably won't see or feel or know in this life. He guarantees that he's there. Behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. Especially in our sorrows and our sufferings and when feelings fall away. And we're terrified, like the disciples on the boat in the storm. And Jesus appears and says, "It is I. Be not afraid." That won't take away your sufferings, it'll transform them. That will fill the emptiness, but it won't take it away. Christ will be there in your sorrow, in your emptiness, in your failures even. And even your sins, if fully repented of, can be used by God. Here, the worst thing St. Peter ever did was he denied knowing Jesus 3 times. He apostatized. What did Jesus do? He looked at Peter. What did Peter do? He went out and wept bitterly. That helped make Peter a saint. Peter was a noble soldier and heroic, stupid sometimes, but heroic, but he was a little arrogant. And he's going to be the first pope. The pope has power, and power tends to corrupt. You don't want an arrogant pope. This is why I personally, although I think our present pope is not a genius and makes all sorts of mistakes, I think his heart is good, and I think he's a saintly man. At least he wants to be a saint, even though we can disagree with him on a lot of issues. Worst thing in the world, an arrogant pope. So Peter's now a humble pope. Why doesn't God give you the grace to overcome this sin and this temptation? Because he's a good doctor. He realizes that if he cured that disease, another side effect would be worse, probably pride. Here, you know somebody who's an alcoholic or a drug addict or a sex addict. This is bad and this is terribly harmful. Why doesn't God, he can, why doesn't he take that away? Because he sees, more than we do, that he wants to work everything for the best good in the end. He foresees that if he took all those sins away, what would he create? Probably a Pharisee. None of us are humble enough. Humility doesn't mean having a low opinion of yourself. Humility means forgetting yourself entirely, leaving it all up to God. That's very hard to do. And if you don't stumble and fall, it's almost impossible to do. So God lets you stumble and fall many times. We learn from our mistakes, including our spiritual mistakes. God's in charge, we are not. And therefore, the last thing that the last apostle says, John was the last apostle, he was the youngest, he lasted into his 90s, and the last line of his first letter is, "Little children, keep yourselves from idols. Only God is God, and trust everything to him. Be on the winning side." I doubt very much whether, because you do that, you will suddenly see miracles happen in our culture. It might, but I doubt it. The way things are going, I think things are going to get much worse before they get better, if they do get better. And maybe it's the end coming. I'm terrified, not just of obvious evils, but of subtler kind of evils. For instance, the so-called transhumanists who are right now at work in Silicon Valley, California, with artificial intelligence, are convinced that they can create artificial immortality. They say, we've conquered nature with our technology, except for one thing, death. Death is nature's trump card. No matter how we conquer the forces of nature during life, we're going to die. Well, not if we have a hand in it, they say. If we can transform our natural biological intelligence into artificial intelligence, if we can replicate the brain in a supercomputer, we can put our soul into a computer, which, not having a body, doesn't die. Or, alternative version, by genetic engineering, we can reprogram our genes, which now say, thou shalt get old and die. And we know what that gene is. We've broken the genetic code. We know just where it is. If we can somehow manipulate that and turn it around and change it to the kind of program you have in a cancer cell. A cancer cell never dies until the host dies. Maybe we can learn the secret of immortal life from cancer. They're working on it. Well, scientists are not agreed as to whether that's theoretically possible, whether that'll ever happen. But there's a lot of people who want to make it happen. Suppose it does. Suppose they discover an immortality pill. What will happen? Well, I think you can do a kind of quasi-scientific experiment to get an image of what will happen in the future if they succeed. Take a dozen eggs and put it on your kitchen table and leave it there for 3 months, and then come back and smell. C.S. Lewis says in his classic Mere Christianity, which I think has done more for ecumenism than any other book ever written, we are like eggs at present, and you can't just go on being a good egg forever. You have to either hatch or go rotten. Death means hatching. And the little deaths that we go through in our sufferings and in our failures are like the big death. They help us to hatch. Oh dear, I am approaching my deadline, but not quite. I can either do 10 minutes more monologue, or we can have 10 minutes extra dialogue. I prefer the second. I hope you do too. I'm going to give myself the hook and deal with your questions now. Is somebody going to help me by reading the questions, or shall I just grab them and read them myself?
I'll go grab those and ask for Amanda.
Okay. Questions are precious. Only humans can ask questions. Animals ask no questions because they're not smart enough. God asks no questions. He's too smart. We're in between. We ask questions.
Once again, Dr. Kreeft, thank you for your presentation. And boy, do we have questions. Perhaps you covered this in the first talk, but certainly suggests another question. How has the devil tricked us into believing he is not real?
That is a very clever device. There's two mistakes you can make about the devil. Don't take him seriously and take him too seriously. If you're at war and you vastly overestimate your enemy's power, you'll shrink back in cowardice. Maybe some of our ancestors made that mistake. Maybe they saw the devil everywhere. But at least equally deadly, if not more deadly, is to minimize his power and maybe even his existence. He's only a myth. We're not at war at all. There are no enemies. And our enemy grins and shoots us dead. Jesus never either overestimated or underestimated the devil's power. How has he succeeded in getting us to disbelieve in his own existence? I don't know. He's very clever. He knows a lot more psychology and sociology than I do. But he's done it, and he's doing it. And we got to be aware of it. And I'm very pleased that at Mass this morning, this parish and this congregation says the St. Michael prayer. That prayer was said after every low Mass in the world until the post-Vatican II revolution ignored Vatican II and worshiped the spirit of Vatican II and said there is no devil, everything's fine. I think that's one of the steps that we have to take to go back. Sometimes going back is the only way to go forward.
Dr. Kreeft, in light of this being an election year, but putting God first, how do you suggest we encounter those in the public square and in our communities and families who believe and promote immoral government?
That's pretty much everybody. Neither party has ever aligned itself completely and perfectly with Catholic morality. So this is a prudential judgment. It's hold your nose and vote for the lesser of two evils.
Okay.
Isn't it wonderful in this land, which is a democracy that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. The people hate both candidates, but they can't do anything about it.
Wise political commentary from Dr. Kreeft. Given that in most spaces in our culture, most visibly in academia, freedom of speech is now apparently heavily persecuted, we've lost most of our training and proving grounds for thought. What can we do on a local or individual level to create spaces that let people, especially those with uninformed mind, seek wisdom?
Just speak the truth in love and let the chips fall as they may and expect that you'll get punished for it. The search for truth and the search for honesty is still in us, even in people who are afraid of it and are dishonest. So speak to that. When Jesus was asked a question, he very seldom answered the question directly. He seemed to avoid the question. He wasn't. The other guy was avoiding the question. He answered the questioner. He answered the real question. He answered the question of the heart behind the words. We have to learn to do that too. So, although this may seem unduly optimistic, I don't think it is. When you confront somebody who is afraid of the truth, speak the truth. You will disturb him. You will make an enemy. You will not make him happy. We're not here in this world to make each other happy. We're here in this world to make each other good.
We've got this question from a couple of folks. Dr. Kreeft, have you not yet been completely canceled in academia?
Well, no. Boston College is still a significantly Catholic school, even though BC stands for barely Catholic. If you want a good Catholic education, you can definitely get a very good one at Boston College. Just take the right courses and the right professors. I don't think I would survive at Harvard. Even Larry Summers didn't survive at Harvard. He's now working in the government. He's quite brilliant. He's a practicing Jew, and he was president of Harvard, and he was a good card-carrying Democrat and a liberal. And he was concerned back in the, I think, 90s, about 30 years ago, as Harvard's president, the fact that Harvard wasn't attracting very many women to the hard sciences, to the STEM courses. They were all going into the humanities. So he held a faculty meeting to discuss the question. He said, let's just discuss the question and then we'll see what we can do about it, see if I can help as a president. So he said, as a scientist, I believe we should use the scientific method. And the scientific method includes getting the data out and formulating the problem and then testing different theories or hypotheses as to which explains the data best. And the data is out, and we have a problem. Fewer and fewer women are going into the hard sciences. And now, why is that? What's the diagnosis of the disease? What's the cause of that? He said there were many theories. The old-fashioned theory, which was held by almost everybody until quite recently, is that there's some innate difference between a man and a woman, not just in their body, but also in their mind. And that women are somehow pre-programmed to be nurses or teachers or helpers, motherly sort of things, and men are more inherently programmed, almost biologically, to be fighters and soldiers and to work out there and to be analytic and scientific and so on, attack on nature. He said, I don't believe that myself, and you probably don't either, but it's at least a theory that most respectable people, even scientists, used to hold. So let's at least discuss that, and then let's discuss the alternatives, which most of us probably believe, that there's no innate differences and that's due to social conditioning and how can we change the conditions. But at least we ought to discuss the theory that used to be held by all respectable scientists and philosophers. The fact that he thought they should discuss that theory so annoyed the feminists that they stood up en masse, went out of the room, interrupted his speech, went into the office of the Board of Trustees, reported to Larry Summers for saying that they ought to discuss at Harvard whether there's some innate difference between a man and a woman, and he got fired. Very quickly. Well, that's the kind of world we're living in. It's nuts. He didn't survive at Harvard. I don't think I would either. But I'm at Boston College. It's one of the few places where there is still relative freedom of speech. They tried to impose a speech code some years ago. The feminists almost took over and said any professor who publicly in a class uses the wrong pronouns will be reported to the dean, and that's going to be put on his record as a black spot. They almost won, but they lost, and they're still losing so far. To relieve the tension a little bit, let me tell you a joke. It's about pronouns. Harvard Divinity School had a crisis because the feminists who prevailed there objected to the traditional pronoun for God, namely he. That's male chauvinism. So the theologians accommodated them and say, okay, it's he or she. And they said, that's not enough. He still comes first. Okay, in reparation for our sin of chauvinism, we'll put the women first. And so the pronoun for God is she or he. And then the earth huggers and the environmentalists and the earth first people chimed in and said, well, you got two of the three pronouns, but you forgot the third one, it. So you got to use that for God too. So they said, okay, let's call God she or he or it. And then they said, well, that's too long, so let's condense it to a single syllable.
Dr. Kreeft's performing 2 shows tonight at Hilarities Comedy Club. Tip your servers. Dr. Kreeft, what are your thoughts on how modern culture has made the villains into heroes, or at minimum, sympathetic?
Isn't it interesting that villains tend to be our heroes? We're more interested in villains than heroes. Very hard to make heroes in a modern epic. Tolkien did it. That's one of the reasons The Lord of the Rings is incredibly popular. It's radically distinctive. Genuine and humble heroes. When Peter Jackson made a movie out of The Lord of the Rings, Jackson's a genius, and the movie has a lot of great things in it. It's got the best background scenes, the best battle scenes I remember in any movie. Anything that had anything to do with technology is done magnificently in The Lord of the Rings. Terrific movie. But the characters, all the heroes, he had to break their legs a little bit. Even Frodo and Sam have an argument, and they almost fall out. And Faramir, who's a kind of a medieval knight, is turned into a suspicious character who kidnaps the hobbits. And Aragorn, the great king, has an identity crisis and has all sorts of weaknesses that he assumed have to be there in any character that modern man is going to sympathize with. He was wrong. That cynicism, that demand to find flaws in characters, that's typically modern. A more extreme version of that is, if you call The Lord of the Rings not a novel but an epic, then the greatest novel ever written is certainly The Brothers Karamazov. And 2 movies have been made about that. One was in the 50s, Hollywood version, which was stupid and shallow, and not a good movie at all, but it tried to be fairly Dostoevskian. But the Soviet Union, the communists, made a movie of it. And I saw it. And it was, in one sense, a better movie, but in another sense, a horrible movie, because all the heroes were villains and all the villains were heroes. Father Zosima, the hero, the saint, was a fool. And Alyosha, whom Dostoevsky says is his hero, was an idiot. Well, that's the devil's strategy. Milton has him say, "Evil be thou my good." It's true that there's both good and evil in every human heart, yes. And it's true that heroes have to be humble, admit that they're sinners too. Yeah, that's true. And it's also true that in every villain, there's the possibility of becoming a hero. Many of the saints were made out of great sinners. That's true. Human hearts are divided, but goodness is not divided, and evil is not divided. And if you don't want to believe in the goodness of goodness or the evil of evil, then you like the modern stuff with heroes who are mainly villains and villains who are mainly heroes.
Going to combine two of these questions together. Can you summarize your reasons for converting to Catholicism? And was your conversion mostly an intellectual assent?
Yes, let me summarize the reasons this way. I read the Church Fathers because I was falling in love with things Catholic, and I thought that was a temptation. I thought, as a good evangelical Protestant, that the Church must be the worst false prophet in the world because she had the highest claim. She claimed to be infallible. How proud, how arrogant, how Pharisaic. How could that be? So I read the Church Fathers to try to prove to myself that Jesus established a simple, humble Protestant church as described in the New Testament, which gradually went corrupt and bad and worldly and selfish and evil in the Middle Ages. And to my big surprise, the more I read, the more I saw a total continuity until the Reformation of things Catholic. They gradually grew and developed like a plant, but it was the same plant. Jesus founded a Catholic church. The doctrine that really blew me away was the Eucharist. Not a single person in the world for 1,000 years doubted the real presence. Nobody had the Protestant view. It was just a sacred symbol. There was one heretic, Berenger of Tours, around the year 1000, who doubted the real presence, and he was excommunicated, and he repented and came back into the church. I said, wait a minute. If the Holy Spirit was sleeping for 1,500 years and letting these stupid Catholics bow down to bread and worshiping wine, confusing the Creator with chemicals, that's a really bad and stupid kind of idolatry. How could that happen? And the papacy and the authority of the church, and Rome has spoken, the case is closed. That was assumed by all Christians until the Reformation. How could the church be that bad? And it was morally bad in the Middle Ages, just as it is today. There were corrupt popes, but they never proclaimed heresy. That's a miracle. There's never been another merely human institution that has survived amidst such corruption. We Catholics are stupid. You want to identify yourself with a biblical character? I'll tell you who to identify with. What animal did Jesus choose to ride into Jerusalem to do his most important work? A jackass. And yet this church of jackasses never contradicted itself, always maintained its doctrine pure and its practice holy, even though its human nature was sometimes spectacularly unholy. That's a miracle. All right, that was the first half of the question. What was the second half of the question?
Was
the head and
about
the heart.
it, intellectual
I was first of all intellectually convinced. I didn't want to become a Catholic. Didn't know any Catholics. My parents would have been scandalized, and they were. I lost some friends. But then I realized that this was Jesus himself calling me. I was alone in my room. And this was not a supernatural vision. It was just the power of imagination. But I saw Noah's Ark, which is a symbol of the church, and all the saints were on board. And I remember seeing, or thinking I saw, or imagining, this was not a sleeping vision, it was just a dreaming imagination. I saw my two favorite saints, Augustine and Aquinas, with their heads poking out of the window of Noah's Ark saying, "Come aboard." And then I saw behind the Ark a little modern skiff, little white, freshly painted boat, being towed by the Ark. And I said, well, I'm on that little boat, but I'm going to get to heaven too. And they said, well, why not come aboard the ark? And I had no answer. I couldn't answer the question, so I did. So it was the same reason I am a Catholic is the reason why a thinking Protestant is a Protestant. He thinks that's where Jesus was, and that's where he wants him to be.
Dr.
If
Kreeft,
it hadn't been for that, it was just a question of theory and thought. I think as an open-minded philosopher, I would have stayed an agnostic forever. There's arguments on both sides. Yeah, the probable here, but the massive degree of evidence that agrees with Catholicism and the many questions that Protestantism doesn't answer, are they sufficient for me to make this lifelong change, this everything change? Maybe not. But then he is not just a theory, he's God incarnate.
Amen. Dr. Kreeft, my husband and I have several young friends who are single and seem more interested in their pets than marriage and children. How do we communicate to them that starting a family should be a priority?
I remember, I think it was in Memphis, Tennessee, there was a woman who had 13 children. She was very black and very large and very happy. And I said, how did you decide to have 13 children? And I said, I didn't. She said, I didn't decide. God decided. I didn't sit down like you would as a philosopher and say, what is irrational? She said, and then came the line, I think having fits is more rational than having children. People don't want to get married nowadays because they see that half of marriages end in divorce. They ask the wrong question about a marriage partner. Will he or she make me happy? That's not the reason you get married. That's not the reason you become a Catholic. Why? Because God's calling you. And it's true and good and beautiful. And is it going to be painful? Yes, of course. The more kids you have, the more likely it is that some of them will really mess up and break your heart. And if you don't want your heart to be broken, there's only one place that you can go to where your heart's never going to be broken. That's inside yourself. If you give your heart to anything, even a pet, it's going to be broken. But a pet won't break your heart as much as a person will. And people who are terribly afraid of suffering and of having their hearts broken aren't going to marry because your spouse might break your heart, and aren't going to have children because the children might break your heart. So if you don't want your heart broken, don't love anybody. And the place where that is perfected is called hell.
Dr. Kreeft, in your academic and speaking career, have you ever been asked to define the true, the good, and the beautiful, and most especially define the beautiful?
Yes, and I've always said no. There's a clear definition of truth. There's a semi-clear definition of goodness. And there's a not very adequate definition of beauty. Truth is simply telling it like it is. Aristotle, master of common sense, defined truth in words of one syllable. That's rare, that's brilliant. It's easy to use words of many syllables. They put you to sleep. Oh, he has authority, he has big syllabled words. But translate that into words of one syllable. If one says of what is that it is, or of what is not that it is not, he speaks the truth. And if one says of what is that it is not, or if one says of what is not that it is, he does not speak the truth. Aristotle was a genius. That's truth. What's goodness? My best definition of goodness is being like God. He's the standard of goodness. That's why he has moral authority. What's beauty? Beauty is whatever breaks your heart. What's the highest compliment you can pay to any artist? Your art broke my heart. It made me weep. Isn't it funny that we weep for joy and we weep for sorrow? They're very similar. In both cases, we know there's something bigger than us. The heart overflows.
You mentioned earlier about the often challenges in our church. Dr. Kreeft, why do you think that when the church is at its most troubled times, saints seem to emerge?
Oh, God does that. God sends saints. Even if you decide to be a saint, God inspired that choice. Firemen appear when there's a fire. Vaccines appear when there's a pandemic. Creeds appear when there's heresies. So saints appear when the world needs them. But saints are like diamonds. They're made by pressure. You don't naturally evolve into a saint. You have to fight. So God is today inspiring many saints, and there are many miracles. In Islamic countries, I'm told by everybody who's ever lived there for a while, there are more miracles and more visions than ever before. And there are more conversions to Christianity, usually secret conversions, than ever before. And almost all of them have to do with miracles and visions. God is doing something there.
Again, combining two questions together here for you. One, is it okay to be angry with culture? And can our anger be destructive to ourselves, our families, and our nation?
Yes, anger tends to be destructive. It doesn't have to be. There's righteous anger. If you identify your enemy correctly, you're not going to be angry at our culture. Our culture is the victim of our enemies. Our enemies are evil spirits. There's no hope for evil spirits. There's hope for the worst human being. There's even a hope for Adolf Hitler, that he may have repented before the bullet hit his brain. Never give up hope for any human being or any human culture. Don't hate it. Save it. Help it. They're crazy. They're your patients. Yeah, but they think that we're their enemies. No, we're not their enemies. We're their doctors and nurses. And even if a patient fights you, you're still the doctor to that patient.
If this was a lecture, I'd tell the class to underline that one. Don't hate the culture, save it and help it. Okay, this is speaking again to the family as a principal source of unity in our culture. Can you offer practical ideas for unity in a family, especially one that's broken? Practical ideas about establishing and fostering unity in a family that's broken.
I will answer that question by answering another question first. The other question is, should you always be totally honest? And my answer is yes. And therefore my answer to the first question is no. I'm not a psychologist. I'm an absent-minded professor. And I don't think I can tell most of you anything that you don't already know.
If you see Dr. Ray Guarendi on the way out, you can take it up with Dr. Ray.
Well, he says the same thing about psychologists that I say about philosophers. They're all pretty much nuts.
Dr. Ray getting a free plug, I tell you. Okay. Dr. Kreeft, C.S. Lewis stated that we are not living in a post-Christian world, but a post-pagan world. Do you agree?
He says we're living in a post-pagan as well as post-Christian world because he says, and I think he quotes Chesterton on this, paganism is like a virgin, an unmarried woman, and Christianity is like a wife, a woman who got married. And modern culture is like a divorcee, and a divorcee does not become a virgin. So paganism is the ally of Christianity. Oh, it's an enemy too. But Christianity emerged from paganism and looked back at paganism and rejected some things and accepted other things. And many pagan things, especially from Greece and Rome, were incorporated into Christianity, starting with the Bible. John, the most profound and philosophical of the evangelist, begins his gospel with a profoundly philosophical term, the term logos. One of the meanings of logos is truth. Another is revelation. He said, in the beginning was the logos, and the logos was God. And the Greek philosophers would say, yes, he's a true philosopher. And then he identifies that with Christ. The logos became flesh. And of course, the Greek philosophers would have rejected that. But the notion of the true, the good, and the beautiful, the notion of moral virtue, the notion of objective truth, that was already firmly in place in the best of paganism. Oriental as well as accidental. Great philosophers like Confucius and Lao Tzu anticipated a lot of what's in the Bible. So paganism was the fertilized ground, and Christianity was the divine seed that flourished in that ground. We have not returned to paganism. If we return to paganism, we still love the true, the good, and the beautiful. We don't. So maybe the first thing we have to do is return to paganism so that we have a natural ground in the human soul for the seed of the supernatural gospel to flourish.
This is a question that speaks to C.S. Lewis's work, the Screwtape Letters, if you're not familiar with that, published in 1942. Do we try to convince Screwtape to switch sides or live a life, pursue love and truth, and let God work out the rest?
No, devils are not persuadable. Devils are hopeless. Do not pray for devils. Do not hope for devils. They're damned forever. They're the object of your anger, not human beings.
In your experience, when did ordinary Catholics lose their evangelical missionary activity? And more importantly, how do we restore it?
Well, you can't give what you don't have, and evangelism is a kind of giving, a kind of good infection, spreading the good infection of the gospel. So the question isn't, I think, when Catholics stopped giving that to others. The question is, when did Catholics stop having that and cherishing that for themselves? And I think the answer to that is from the beginning. There have always been wheat and tares in the church. There have always been bad Catholics and good Catholics. And I don't see the current generation as significantly better or worse than any other. So I can't point to one era and say, well, at this point Catholics lost their faith. Or at this point Catholics saw their faith as a purely selfish and individual thing and didn't give it out to the culture. I don't think there's any such single time. It's a permanent temptation.
Mindful that mothers and fathers have a high obligation for their children, do you think that grandparents in particular have a special obligation?
Yeah, especially today when parents have lost a lot of authority. And when psychologists are telling children, divorce from your parents, as well as telling spouses to divorce from each other. So grandparents are like gurus. They don't have the problem that parents have. Parents have a problem of having been parents, having exercised their God-given authority over their children in ways that are less than totally successful, whether that's their fault, their children's fault, or both. Grandparents are more remote from their children. They're like professors at a university. They're safe. So kids probably listen to them more now than the parents, so they have little doors of opportunity. They can preach and get away with it more than parents can. So be sure you stay close to your grandchildren.
Dr. Kreeft, do you feel that it is possible for members of a society that is devolving to completely lose any grasp of conscience?
That is a good question. C.S. Lewis and Thomas Aquinas, two of my favorite writers, seem to disagree about that. Can the natural law ever be abolished from the heart of man? Aquinas says no. Lewis, in The Abolition of Man, seems to say yes. But Aquinas actually has a middle position. He says the fundamental principles of the natural law cannot be abolished. If we were speaking in today's computer language, he would say, it's impossible to destroy your moral motherboard. But, Aquinas says, vicious habits can so occlude or eclipse the knowledge of the natural law that it seems not to be there anymore. You meet people who have absolutely no moral conscience in a certain area, and it's almost always sexual. They have no idea and no moral idea about why in the world did these stupid people in the past think that sodomy was unnatural, or that contraception was unnatural, or how could anyone ever possibly have any other motive than authoritarian oppression for saying that a woman shouldn't abort her child. They have no idea at all. Yes, they do. It's suppressed, but it's there. St. Paul says that in Romans 1, talking about the pagans, the bad things about the pagans. They know the truth, but they suppress it. Now, here I think a famous atheist psychologist can be of great help to us. His name is Sigmund Freud. And he discovered that the unconscious mind is much more powerful than the conscious mind. And that much, he thought all, of the activity of the conscious mind was rationalization of the subconscious. Well, subconsciously, deep down, we know that we're obligated to be good and not evil, and that there is a real good and a real evil. And we have to make an effort to suppress that knowledge. And that effort is sometimes going to flag. Atheists and immoralists are going to have their doubts. And conscience is going to take its revenge. And the door is going to open a little bit. And when you see that door open a little bit in somebody, put your foot in it. So in that sense, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic not so much about our culture, but about the human heart, which was designed in heaven, not in Hollywood.
Well, you may have just answered our last question. So what elements in culture or in the church do you find the most hope?
People who want to be saints, people who want to give God everything, people who want to say to God in every way, every day, with their whole being, your will, not mine, be done. There's a lot of people like that. I think most of the people here are like that. And although we always knew that we should be like that, the knowledge that we have to be like that is much clearer today in our cultural emergency than it was before. So out of this decadence is coming something good. God is using even this evil, this massive cultural evil, to raise up saints. So that's our job. That's our job description. Be a saint. What else is there after all?
Well, Dr. Kreeft, thank you very much for your presentations this morning and for taking our questions. Well, I appreciate very much all the great questions we received. We've still got a little bit left in our program. We appreciate your patience. At this time, we have a couple of representatives from Westside Catholic Couples that are going to come up and speak a few words. So if you can indulge us for just a few more minutes, we'd really like to have your participation and listening to Chris and Megan's slattery.
What a tease to be able to stand up and have to sit back down, so we will make this quick.